Hello everyone and welcome back to another video in our Autodesk Inventor professional tutorial. In the previous videos we talked about the place component features and editing and creating components in an assembly. And in the last video we even created a very simple two-component assembly. At the end of that video we briefly mentioned the constraints. Constraints are the most frequently used features in the assembly mode, just like the extrude feature in a part mode. And once you learn that, the rest is pretty easy. And it makes sense, right? Constraints determine how the components come together in the assembly. You design your 3D objects, you save them in your folder, you downloaded CAD files from online websites or from a supplier websites. Now you need to put them together, but they can't just be floating in space. You need to determine how they come together. That's when the constraints come into play. So in this video, we're going to talk about the mate and flush constraints in the assembly mode. So for that, let's create a couple of dummy objects, and we basically use the constraints to determine the relationship between those objects. So let's use the drop-down menu on the top left corner and select Part, and that will take us to Part 1. And we will create a new sketch there. Let's right-click and click on New Sketch and select the XY plane. And now in the drop-down menu of the rectangle option, I'm going to select two-point center rectangle. As you come to the center point, it will highlight as with the green color, and then I will click and start drawing my rectangle. Before we click again and dimensioning it, let's dimension it here. I will enter 100 millimeter for this and 100 millimeter for the height, and my square sketch is created. Let's right-click and finish 2D sketch and then extrude. And let's just use the default extrusion distance by 10 millimeters and click OK. Now this object is created. Now let's save this in the constraints folder that I created on my desktop. You can do the same thing, or you can just save them to your desktop. I'm going to leave it as part 1. I'm not going to rename it. And let's just click Save. Now part 1 is created in that folder. Let's go ahead and create another part. And again, start a 2D sketch, XY plane. And notice that the two-point center rectangle is now my default option because that's the last used feature. Until you restart the software, this will stay as the last used feature. So don't be surprised when you see it changed. Again, I'm going to select the two-point center rectangle and come to the center point. And this time, let's call it 150 millimeters by 150 millimeters, slightly bigger. So finish 2D sketch and right click extrude, and instead of 10 millimeters, let's call this 15 millimeters and click OK. Now part 2 is created, and let's save that in the same folder as well. And now part 1 and part 2 are saved in the same folder. Let's go ahead and start an assembly now. Now assembly 1 is created, and but there's nothing in it. I intentionally did it this way because in the last video what we did is we started an assembly and we used the create component feature to create the parts in the assembly. You can do that, or you can create the parts and you can just bring them to your assembly by using the place component option, which we talked about in 2 videos ago. So now, but also there are different ways to do this, of course, depending on how you want to create your assembly. Because we created our components, I can go back to my part 1 and select part 1 and hit Control C on my keyboard, basically copy the component, and go back to assembly 1 and Control V on the keyboard. And that's just going to copy and paste in the assembly, copy and paste the component in the assembly. Or what I can do is I have my folder, which is part 1 and part 2 are saved, and I can just simply drag and drop the component in the assembly. So part 2 at this time, I can just drag and drop the component and close this. So let's see what happened here. In the assembly now, I have 2 components, part 1 and part 2. If I try to drag and move the component 1, part 1, it's not going to go anywhere because it is the first component I added to my assembly. So Autodesk Inventor assumed that I'm going to use this component as my reference part. So that's why there's a thumbtack icon next to part 1. It is fixed in space, but part 2 is not. Part 2 can move all over the place. So it doesn't have any relationship in reference to the first part. But that's the reason why the first part is grounded, so I can use it as a reference. Now I can basically use the constraints to determine where this part goes. So I can use the constraint option here in the relationships menu, or I can right click and select constraint. That's going to bring the place constraint option window on the screen. Now notice that there are multiple sections here that we will talk about in detail, but the first one is the type of constraint. Is it a mate constraint, angle constraint, tangent constraint, insert constraint, and symmetry constraint? Most likely, the most commonly used one is going to be mate constraint. But of course, depending on the geometries, you will use the other constraints as well in the future. But as you learn the mate constraint, the rest will make more sense. Just like the extrude feature in part one. You just learn that one. That's the most basic feature. And whatever you learn after that makes more sense because it's kind of similar. It's just the application changes with the geometry of the component. So the mate constraint is highlighted, and I have this other section here where I determine the selections. Notice that there are two selections, and the first one is highlighted. This changes based on the type of the constraint. So if I go to type constraint, angle constraint, notice that I have three selections, and the solutions change as well. And if I go to tangent, insert, or symmetry, these change accordingly. Let's go back to the mate constraint. So now what it's telling me is pick a geometry to constraint in the command prompt. And the selection one is highlighted. You don't have to do anything here. All you have to do is just basically select a feature to constrain. So in this case, I want to constrain this face to the face of the first grounded component. So I select this face here, and you can see the arrow kind of appearing on the face, this green arrow. That's showing that that's the face you are using to constrain. And you can select the second face here. Now they're just going to be mated together. And this is kind of like your two hands when you're clapping. That's how they come together, right? The inside of your left hand and the palm of your right hand, they mate. And that's the mate constraint. And that's basically you're doing the same thing between two components. And you can see it in the preview. The arrow of the coming from this face here, highlighted with red, and arrow coming from that face of the basically yellow transparent box, and that's where they are mated. So if you click apply, this window is not going to disappear, which means that you can continue to apply constraints. But if you click OK, it's going to disappear with the constraint in place. Now two components are constrained. This component is still not going to move anywhere because it's grounded, but this component can move around. The only thing that's not going to change is it's always going to be mated from those faces. And if you go to the browser tree, and if you expand these components, you see that the mate constraint is applied to both components. And as you highlight it, you can see where the constraint is applied. So if I am looking at the design of assembly that somebody else created, I can I can basically just highlight the constraint here and see, okay, the designer constrained these two faces. I can see how they constrained it. So again, you can of course do undo and go back to the original state, or you can come to the mate here and you can just hit delete. But when you say delete here, it's probably going to delete this offset number. So you can always go to right click menu and select delete. At that point, now you deleted the constraint. Now you can again move this back. Let's look at the flush constraint now. Let's right click and go to constraint menu. This time, let's change it to the flush constraint. And flush constraint is if you put your hands on a table, now the palms of your hands are flush because the table in front of you is acting as the constraint. Now they're just like one of them is not higher than the other one. So that's the flush constraint. Let's select, in this case, for the flush constraint, again, the prompt is saying pick geometry to constraint. Let's select this face here and select this face here and click OK. Notice that now they are flush from those surfaces. I can move this all over the place. It looks like it's kind of moving back and forth, but actually it's not. It's just the distance is changing as I'm moving it. But one thing that doesn't change is they will always stay flush from those faces. And let's just delete this flush as well. Now we're back to the original state. This is grounded and this is not. So now let's create another component because we want to talk about other constraint other geometries and how they are constrained in the mate constraint function. So let's go ahead and create a part 3 and start a 2D sketch. This time it's not a rectangle. We're not going to use a rectangle. We're going to use a center point circle. And we're going to make a cylindrical 3D object. Let's call this 50 millimeter, maybe smaller, 25 millimeter in diameter. Let's finish 2D sketch and apply an extrusion. Let's call that 100 millimeters. And let's save this again as part 3 and then go back to our assembly. And this time, let's just use the place component feature and select part 3. Now it is on my cursor. It's not placed yet because I haven't um, clicked on the screen. Now I did. Now the first part 3 is added. I can keep adding more, but I'm going to go ahead and select OK, and because this is one of them is fine. And just one little trick. Let's say you added your components and you want to add more of these. And you don't want to constantly click on place component or open a folder on your desktop to drag and drop or copy and paste. What you can do is always you can just select a part in the browser tree and you can drag and drop it. You can keep doing that, and then it will uh, just number them accordingly. For example, the first one is part 3 1, and the second one is part 3 2. You can keep doing that. For example, you can again click on one component, hit Control C, and then click anywhere on the screen and click Control V, and you can add more components. These are just other alternatives that you have to add more components to your assembly, just to save time. So what I want to do is I want to maybe mate these two in a way that this second part cannot move. And then I want to also constrain this cylindrical object to these two components. So let's start with that. And I want to be able to go in the assembly. As you know, if these windows, part 1, part 2, part 3, are open in the CAD software, if I double click on this, it will take me to that part1.ipt. I don't want that. I want to be able to edit these components in the assembly. So I'm going to close these, part 1, part 2, and part 3. Now, if I double click, it will gray out everything. Everything else will be transparent, and I will be able to edit this component. So we are going to create a sketch on this surface of this part 1, and maybe center point circle. I think what we did was 25 millimeters, right? Yes, 25 millimeters, and finish 2D sketch, and then extrude and cut all through, and that's it. Okay, so now we have this part 1 with a hole in the middle. Let's use this cylindrical object to constrain, in reference to this part 1 and the hole in the middle. So let's go to the right-click menu and select Constraint. And this time, let's make this flush with the back of this part 1. So I'm going to select this face here. Notice that it moved the part to the other side. I do not want that. I want this part to be on this side, and I want everything to be flush, right? So because I did not change the solution in the constraint, if I change to flush option, now it did what I was expecting it to do. Now it is kind of going through the part, but the end of the cylindrical object is flush with the back face of the part 1. And this is a toggle. You can just keep going back and forth to see which option you like, and you can select apply. Because when I hit apply, now I still have the place component window available for me. Now what I want to do is I want the cylindrical object to be mated with the hole in the middle because they're the same diameter. And they didn't have to be same diameter, by the way, but I made it that way so that it doesn't get confusing. But notice that I cannot just use the axes in the middle of this cylindrical object because the flush solution is active. If you go back to the mate solution and come to the part 3, now this axis in the middle of this object appears. Now I can select that axis, and I can do the same thing with the hole here. Now when I do that, notice that it perfectly mated the cylindrical object with the hole in the middle from the part 1. Now I can just select apply. But notice that as I'm dealing with a round object, I have different solution options, and you can always explore those as well. Right now, nothing is changing because this is a very just consistent part. As we deal with, for example, screws in the future, you will see that this toggle availability is pretty handy. So let's just click OK. Now this is fixed, and now this component is made it to by the surface here, and also the flush constraint, mate constraint, is applied from the axis of the part 1 and part 3. So let's see what's moving here. This is not moving. This is probably rotating because we did not apply a constraint there, but it doesn't matter right now. It is where we want it to be, but this component is moving. So let's make that also constrained to the first component as well. So let's right click and maybe constrain this face to this face and hit apply. I'm still in the same window. Maybe well, let's get out of it, see what happened. You can always do this to make sure where you are. Notice that it's just moving around, but it's still constrained from the faces. Let's right click and change it to flush constraint. And I want it to be flush from the top faces, right? I select this face and hit OK. Notice that now it is not only mated from the faces, but also it is flush on the top faces, but it is moving this way. So that basically gives me an idea what the next constraint should be. I should probably constrain these two faces right here. So I go to right click menu and constraint, change it to flush constraint, and select these two faces and hit apply. And now it's not going to move anywhere. Basically what you did is you have a fixed component in space. That's the component you're using as a reference, and all the other constraints that you apply, just make it just take advantage of that first reference geometry. So I want to do Control Z and basically delete that flush that we just applied. As you are learning the software from the beginning for the first time, it is perfectly understandable that you try to apply a mate constraint here. So let's see what happens when we do that. If I click here and select here, notice that it didn't even show me a preview of it. It is trying to mate these two faces, which doesn't make sense because it already applied the constraint to faces and this top face. And it already mated them from those faces with the flush one, and then also it is mated from the top faces. So if I try to apply, it's going to say that this assembly cannot be solved because you have mates that contradict with each other. And when you see this kind of error, you probably asked the Autodesk Inventor to solve something that cannot be solved. So you can just cancel operation and realize that, oh, okay, I applied the mate constraint, but what I should have done is a flush constraint. Right here, select done. So now you have all these objects mated together, and you can go to the browser tree and see what constraints you applied and what relationship they have, among themselves. You see that if you highlight flush one, you see that this component is flush with this component. This component is flush with this component. If you go to mate one, notice that axis is used to mate these two components. And again, you can delete them. I just want to repeat that part. You can delete these constraints. Just don't use the delete button on your keyboard because you will probably accidentally delete the value here. Instead, right-click and click delete, and that's going to delete all those constraints. So let's do that and select all these constraints and say delete, and then everything is deleted now. Everything should move freely. Before we end the video, I want to talk about something also important. When you go to constraint and you select, say, this face of the part 1 and this face of the part 2, notice that it automatically creates a 0 mm offset, but you can change that. You can say, for example, it's a 10 mm offset, and you will see the preview of it. It will constrain these two components, but it will keep 10 mm distance between them. And you can do the same thing with the flush constraint as well. So again, you can apply similar constraints with offset values even with the axis. Um, for example, if I select this and this, but instead if I go 25 mm, offset, it will offset the component 25 millimeters in reference to the fixed geometry. We will again use these options, constraints pretty frequently in the following videos as we try to constrain and make different objects in our assembly. And as you deal with different geometries, you have to use different constraints, and we will talk about the other constraint alternatives in the future videos. So please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and see you in the next video.